It has become a common accusation lately that someone is guilty of virtue signaling. To levy this accusation against someone is to claim that she has committed something like an ethical fallacy. She is charged with laying claim to virtue or moral superiority, even though she is not really virtuous. Talk of virtue signaling might straight away invite the ethicist to think of virtue ethics, and perhaps also of that system's fundamental representative, Aristotle. She supposes that it is in Aristotle's ethics, if anywhere, that we might find the roots of the proper meaning of virtue signaling. Seeking the charge's origin story could only help add to an understanding of what it means in truth to call someone a virtue signaler, and also why it's blameworthy. Yet for those who are not ethicists, the connection between Aristotle's virtue ethics and virtue signaling might not be readily apparent. So it is incumbent on those who see the connection to provide a sounder understanding of what virtue signaling is and a clearer explanation for why it is wrong. Aristotle's ethical framework provides satisfying and correct answers to some of the most pressing questions relevant for defining virtue signaling and accounting for its wrongness. For instance, what is the difference between a virtue signal and an authentic symptom of virtue? And why is it wrong or blameworthy for someone who is not virtuous to lay claim to virtue? So I proceed by presenting an account of virtue signaling and its wrongness that is consistent with Aristotle's virtue ethics. First, I clarify what it means for virtue signaling to be the misrepresentation of one's ethical character as virtuous when it is not. Next, I discuss Aristotle's definition of genuine virtue and three of its authentic symptoms, distinguishing them from the pretense of virtue and virtue signals. Finally, I show why it is wrong or blameworthy for someone to virtue signal on Aristotle's account. Section 1. A genuine virtue signaler misrepresents her character as virtuous, even though it is not. She depicts herself as having an ethical character superior to the one she actually has. One might suppose that it is a necessary condition of virtue signaling that someone intentionally misrepresents her character. But this is not the case. A thoroughly evil villain, for instance, could certainly intentionally misrepresent her vile character as virtuous in order to secure a good reputation and shield herself from neighborly suspicions. Such a villain's misrepresentation of her character counts as virtue signaling. Yet not every accusation of virtue signaling is levied against someone intent on masking her true character, like the villain. Someone who's not a villain, yet not quite thoroughly good or heroic either, can unintentionally misrepresent her character as virtuous when it is not, and so merit the charge of virtue signaling. If such a person assesses herself to have a better character than she actually does, and so supposes herself virtuous, she is then just as capable as the villain of misrepresenting her character. She differs from the villain in one important respect. She does not intentionally misrepresent her character in order to hide her actual character. In fact, she does not intentionally misrepresent her character at all, since she represents it in a way that is consistent with what she believes, however falsely, is true about her actual character. This agent is a virtue signaler because she misrepresents herself as virtuous when she is not. Intentional misrepresentation is not a necessary condition of virtue signaling. So I understand virtue signaling to be a charge against people who misrepresent their characters as virtuous when they are not. And further, it is not necessary that virtue signalers intentionally misrepresent their characters, since someone who is not virtuous can falsely believe that she is in fact virtuous. Finally, the only people who cannot virtue signal are those who have virtuous characters, for only those who have characters inferior to virtue are able to misrepresent their characters as virtuous. Section 2. Virtue signals are means of misrepresenting one's inferior character as virtuous. Virtue's authentic symptoms are legitimate indicators that an agent has a virtuous character. Virtue signals enable character misrepresentation because they mimic or they are derivative copies of character virtue's authentic symptoms. The real symptoms of virtue issue from the inside out, as it were. They indicate that someone is virtuous because they originate from her actually virtuous character. Virtue signals, on the other hand, reverse this order. People make use of them to misrepresent their non-virtuous characters as virtuous. In the following subsections, I clarify what Aristotle holds virtue is, what he holds its symptoms are, and what virtue signals are, and how they mimic virtue's authentic symptoms. Section 2.1. Aristotle defines virtue as a choice-making disposition of character, being intermediate with respect to us, determined by reason, and as the practically wise person would determine it. Now, the most relevant feature of Aristotle's definition for present purposes is that it is a choice-making disposition of character. Dispositions of character, or character types, bear an interesting relation to the choices an agent enacts, or her actions. The relation between the choices an agent enacts and the disposition of character she develops is similar to the relation between an object's position and its velocity. Since an object's velocity is a measure of the rate at which an object's position changes over time, it is impossible to measure its velocity on the basis of a single measurement of its position at only one time. In order to calculate the object's velocity, at least two data points designating its position at two distinct times are necessary. An agent's enacted choices are like the object's position measurements in the analogy, while her disposition of character is like the object's velocity measurement. Now, just as a single measurement of an object's position is insufficient for measuring the velocity at which it is traveling, likewise, a record of a single enacted choice is insufficient to indicate an agent's disposition of character. In order to determine an agent's character type, an observer needs a record of several of the agent's enacted choices. If the record reveals a consistent pattern of choice making, then it also reveals her disposition of character. Aristotle provides an account like this for character virtue when presenting the three criteria an agent must satisfy in order to perform genuinely virtuous actions. He writes, the things that come about through the virtues, for instance, the actions that are performed justly or temperately, are not what they are only if they themselves are disposed in a certain way, but also if the one performing them acts while herself being disposed in a certain way. First, she must do them knowingly. Second, she must choose to do them, that is, choose them for their own sakes. And third, she must do them while herself being steadily and unchangingly disposed. End quote. Facts about actions themselves are insufficient evidence that the actions are genuinely virtuous. Facts about the person acting also matter. And this is what Aristotle presents the three criteria to explain. Satisfying the first criterion is largely irrelevant for the determining whether a person's actions are genuinely virtuous, whereas satisfying the other two criteria makes all the difference regarding whether her actions are genuinely virtuous. The first criterion is irrelevant because of Aristotle's view that character virtue arises as a result of the habitual performance of virtuous actions over time. An agent only likely risks failing to meet the first criterion in the early stages of developing virtue. Once she starts practicing virtuous actions, she knows what they are, and that is why she's doing them rather than other kinds of actions. Someone develops a virtuous character by habitually performing actions that are of a certain type, say just or temperate, until she becomes the sort of person who fulfills the second and third criteria, that is, becoming a person who chooses to perform just or temperate actions for their own sake and also holds steadily and unchangingly as a just or temperate person. The upshot is that when Aristotle defines virtue as a choice-making disposition of character, he means that a virtuous person is the sort of person whose record of enacted choices gives rise to a consistent pattern of choice-making. Virtue is not the only character type that Aristotle thinks that people can develop. He holds that virtue, self-control, unself-control, and vice are all character types. Each corresponds to its own consistent pattern of choice making. It is important to recognize that virtue is not the only character type because of a point made in the last section, namely that the only people barred from virtue signaling are people with virtuous characters. So stated positively, people with self-controlled, unself-controlled, and vicious characters are all capable of virtue signaling, since they are all capable of misrepresenting their actual characters incorrectly or falsely as virtuous. Section 2.2. Virtue's authentic symptoms are indicators that someone has a virtuous character. They originate from her character. Virtue signals, on the other hand, are copies of the real symptoms of virtue, and agents with character types inferior to virtue make use of them in order to misrepresent their characters as virtuous. But what are the authentic symptoms of virtue, which virtue signals mimic? Aristotle considers at least three. The first symptom of virtue is an agent's performance of a genuinely virtuous action. This is the substantial point of the third criterion from earlier, namely that an agent must be steadily and unchangingly disposed as virtuous herself in order to perform genuinely virtuous action. This also means that not all virtuous actions are genuinely virtuous. Take, for instance, someone who has not yet developed character virtue, but practices by performing virtuous actions. On her way to becoming temperate, Aristotle holds that such an agent habitually chooses and performs temperate actions. The actions she habitually chooses and performs gives rise to her character. Aristotle affirms that actions are responsible for character types in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 3. He writes, "It is necessary to examine things related to actions, that is, how they must be performed, since these are authors of the kinds of dispositions of character that they produce." End quote. Once this person has developed a virtuous character, she still consistently performs virtuous actions, but now she performs genuinely virtuous actions since they issue from her virtuous character. There is then a distinction between genuinely virtuous actions and virtuous actions that do not issue from an actual virtuous character. Yet, when someone performs a virtuous action, it is not always easy for an observer to tell whether the action is genuinely virtuous. For the observer to be sure, she has to know the agent's character. If the observer is uncertain about the agent's character, then she cannot tell whether her action is genuinely virtuous. Nevertheless, it stands that the performance of a genuinely virtuous action is an authentic symptom of virtue. Aristotle also holds that the pleasure or pain that an agent takes in her actions is symptomatic of her character. He writes, "The point should be made that the pleasure or pain that comes about from actions is a symptom of disposition of character. For the person abstaining from bodily pleasures, who enjoys abstinence itself, is the temperate person, while the person loaded with grief at abstaining is the self-indulgent person." End quote. Aristotle claims that virtuous agents enjoy performing virtuous actions, while vicious agents enjoy their vicious actions and detest performing virtuous ones. He holds that it is generally true that people enjoy performing the sorts of actions that issue from their character types. This second symptom seems to provide a way for an observer to tell whether an agent's action is genuinely virtuous without having to look inside and know her character. For instance, an observer can take into account the agent's outward reactions to her own actions when assessing whether they are genuinely virtuous. If the agent performs a virtuous action and also appears to enjoy it, the observer has more evidence before her suggesting that the agent's character is in fact virtuous. More evidence, that is, that the action is symptomatic of an actual virtuous character than observing the action by itself provides. This evidence is not foolproof, as I will show when considering the virtue signal that mimics this second symptom. Nevertheless, the pleasure that an agent takes in performing virtuous actions is an authentic symptom of character virtue. The third symptom of virtue Aristotle considers relates to choice. Since the character types are choice-making dispositions, the kinds of choices that agents make are symptoms of their characters. In fact, Aristotle holds that an agent's choices are more reliable indicators of her character than her actions are. He writes, "It follows next that we discuss choice, for choice seems very closely related to virtue, and to distinguish the character types from one another more so than actions do." End quote. Aristotle defines choice as deliberate desire for the things that are up to us. So he thinks that the character types are distinguished according to the different deliberate desires that agents have. Virtuous agents make the correct choices, which means they have correct deliberate desires. An observer who wants to tell whether someone is virtuous runs into a problem with respect to this third symptom, similar to the obstacles she faces when considering the first symptom. If someone's choice can be a genuine symptom of character virtue, and if choice is a sort of desire, then the observer must be privy to the agent's desires in order to ascertain whether her choice is in fact virtuous. Just as the observer needs to know an agent's disposition in order to determine whether her action is genuinely virtuous, the observer also needs to know what an agent's deliberate desire is in order to determine whether her choice is genuinely virtuous. Choice may be a better indicator or distinguishing mark of a person's character than action, but an observer without insight into the agent's internal life cannot easily tell whether either is genuinely virtuous. Nevertheless, virtuous choice is an authentic symptom of virtue. Section 2.3. Virtue signals mimic or are derivative copies of virtue's authentic symptoms. The problems that the observer above faces when attempting to determine whether someone's character, action, or choice is genuinely virtuous shed light on how it is possible for someone who is not virtuous to mimic virtue's authentic symptoms. Remember that virtue's first symptom is the performance of a genuinely virtuous action. Yet, I noted that there is a conceptual difference between genuinely virtuous actions that issue from a virtuous character on the one hand, and virtuous actions that do not issue from a virtuous character on the other. In the light of this difference, and because virtue signals mimic virtue's real symptoms, it is clear that virtuous actions that don't issue from a virtuous character are indeed virtue signals. Such actions are capable of misrepresenting an agent's character as virtuous, even though it is not. Moreover, this is why an observer cannot easily tell whether an action is genuinely virtuous. Next, remember that virtue's second system is the pleasure an agent takes in the performance of a virtuous action. I noted that this symptom, when compresent with the first, lends more evidence to the observer that someone does in fact have a virtuous character. However, if determining whether someone enjoys performing a virtuous action depends on observing her outward reactions to performing it, then yet again, the observer runs into trouble. Just as a polite guest can swallow down and pretend to enjoy the foul dinner her host has prepared for her, so too can a person pretend to enjoy performing virtuous actions. The pretense of enjoyment and the pretense of enjoying performing a virtuous action counts as a virtue signal, for it mimics the authentic enjoyment that a virtuous agent takes in performing genuinely virtuous actions. Finally, recall that virtue's third symptom, virtuous choice, does not itself seem easy to mimic. Yet the only access that an observer typically has to someone's choice or deliberate desire is through what that person reports. It is certainly possible for someone who is not virtuous to report falsely that she has made a choice that she knows accompanies virtue. If someone claims about herself that she has made a choice that aligns with character virtue, but really hasn't, then this counts as mimicking one of virtue's real symptoms, and so it is a virtue signal. Suspicion may arise should an observer discover that the agent has not enacted her reported choice. Nevertheless, her reported choice is a virtue signal mimicking actual virtuous choice. Section 3. Virtue signaling is wrong for at least 2 reasons, and these reasons attach to intentional and unintentional cases of character misrepresentation, respectively. Intentional virtue signaling is wrong because it's deceptive. If someone with a non-virtuous character signals that she has a virtuous one on purpose, then she misleads the observers around her in order to secure a reputation for goodness that she doesn't merit. She seeks to take advantage of the trust of the members of her community with her intentional character misrepresentation. So it is clearly blameworthy. Yet unintentional virtue signaling is also wrong, but for a different reason, namely because it harms the signaling agent herself. When an agent falsely believes that she has a virtuous character and misrepresents her character with one of the virtue signals, she does not seek to take advantage of the members of her community. Instead, she dupes herself by believing her own false assessment of her own character, making it difficult for her to make progress toward becoming virtuous. Aristotle would liken such a signaler to a sick person who listens intently to her doctor's words, but does not abide by her prescriptions. The sick do not become healthy like this. And similarly, a person does not develop character virtue just by mimicking its symptoms outwardly. To develop a virtuous character, she has to habitually enact virtuous choices. And she cannot proceed to become virtuous without being honest with herself about the state of her actual character.